fix in case my voice doesn't hold out. You know, I'm used to singing, but I'm not used to talking for longer than an hour, and something at that point it starts to fade. So today I'm going to talk about technology policy. So I hear that, so you guys have been learning about emissions pricing, emissions trading. So what have you done? What have you done in the past couple of classes? So yeah.
Trading, trading, an overview, actually. Policy instruments. Well, externalities and public good resources and common pool resources.
Okay, great.
Information failures.
Okay, good. So that'll be really good background for today's lecture. I'll bring in a lot of those issues and hopefully deepen them a bit more. So I think we're all familiar with the climate change problem. That's sort of what motivates a lot of this research on technology policies. So the idea being that if we really have any hope of trying to limit temperature increase to something like 2 degrees, we're going to need pretty rapid and very deep reductions in fossil fuels, and that means a pretty significant change in the technologies that we're using and also then the policies to get us there. Now, when I say technological change, there's actually different types of technological change that one can think about. So one is changing the mix of the existing technologies that we use over time. Another is changing the cost or the productivity of these technologies, so bringing the cost down so they're cheaper to use clean technologies. And then you can also think about developing totally new breakthrough technologies or backstop technologies. And then the question is, well, how can we bring about technological change, and what are the best policy tools? So we're economists, that's what we care about. What are the best policy tools for achieving these goals, especially in a decentralized manner? So creating the incentives for people to adopt technologies and innovate. And I hope that what you've learned in your previous classes says, first and foremost, a carbon price. So pricing that emissions externality that's out there. So the question we're going to talk about today is, well, is carbon pricing enough to get us there? Is carbon pricing alone efficient? Under what conditions is it and is it not efficient? So can carbon pricing alone induce, what we think of as the right amount of technological change? The other question is politically, can the carbon price really be made to fully reflect the social cost of carbon, given the variety of constraints we may have? So indeed, if we look at other disciplines, there's really much less of a focus on the carbon price and much more of a focus on technologies themselves or questions of technical feasibility. So there's some very famous work by folks at Princeton, Pakala and Sokolow, on stabilization wedges. Have you heard of these? Have you heard of this work? So they basically do an inventory of different technologies, existing technologies that we have for cleaning our energy system. And you can sort of see a picture of some of them here. And they figure out, wedge, like a combination of these policies that each would produce, say, a 10% reduction in emissions. And then you sort of add up the wedges that you need to get to like an 80% reduction target like the EU is talking about, or et cetera. So they're really focused on how, technically can we get these reductions? But what's missing in this analysis is sort of a sense of, well, what's the cost of doing that? And how might we actually incentivize that rather than dictating that we shall use these wedges? You see among policymakers also really a big focus on technology. Now in the US, we were unable to implement a carbon price. And so what you see coming out of the administration is very much a focus on technology. So this is the President's Climate Action Plan from last year. And you can see the top item is deploying clean energy. So that's using regulations to cut emissions from power plants and require better technologies, and it's and subsidizing renewable energy, basically. And sort of similar in the transportation sector, using regulations to improve fuel economy, and then also incentives to deploy technologies, so subsidies primarily. So we see really a focus on technologies and less about carbon pricing. Now the EU actually has an emissions trading system and a carbon price. Well, that's very low right now. It's gotten a little bit higher. But we see that they, so even implementing a cap and trade program, they decided, well, that's not enough for us. We want redundancy. We want additional policies. So they have, the famous 20-20-20 by 2020 goals. Now, does that sound like something that they came up with after doing extensive cost-benefit analysis to find the optimal policy levels? No, but it sounds cool, doesn't it? Yeah. So they're requiring. They have a target of increasing the share of renewables in the economy to 20%, and that target's going very well. This is from a couple years ago. I stole it from a slideshow from one of the commissioners. And then also a target to improve energy efficiency. Apparently this one's not going as well. It's proving really difficult to bring about. But they have these overlapping targets. Even the IEA actually is, in one sense, advocating a technology-oriented program that could be implemented worldwide without needing to fuss and fret about carbon pricing. So they basically say that at least to stop emissions growth by 2020 worldwide, using 4 technology policies, you can do that. And so that would be, first of all, you got to stop building dirty coal plants, dealing with methane releases from oil and gas extraction, getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. I don't know if you've had a chance to talk about that, but that's a big issue in the OECD and the G, I forget whatever number right now. I guess they're one down with Russia right now. But, and then, a big, huge chunk of that is energy efficiency policies. So half of that is energy efficiency policies. So then you got to hope that that's a lot easier in the rest of the world than it is in Europe, because they're relying on that. But in theory, you can get there by sort of mandating technology mandates. Of course, again, how cost effective is that? So what's going on here? All the economists are saying, just price the carbon, but none of the policymakers are saying, yay, let's price the carbon. So, is it that they're really just ignoring our advice? In an idealized world, if there aren't any other market failures and the emissions externality is what you care about, then a carbon price should be sufficient, set at the Pigouvian level. And then actually adding anything else on top of that just distorts the decisions the market is making and actually raises your costs. So once you've optimally priced emissions, layering on other policy targets forces the market away from that optimal allocation, and it actually increases costs. Does that make sense? Okay. So the question is, why are they doing this? There's kind of a neat little study. It's kind of a back-of-the-envelope calculation by Claudio Mercantonini and Denny Ellerman at the European University Institute where they calculate, what has been the cost of abatement with renewables in the EU. Sort of ignoring the fact that you don't actually get any abatement because this is under the cap and trade system when the cap sets the emissions reductions. But, so what has been the cost of this in terms of the emissions reduced out of the electricity sector? And we see that for wind, okay, so we have Germany in blue, Italy in red, and then Spain in green. It was originally. It looks kind of yellow here. And so for wind, we see even in Germany, where it's the cheapest, it's 56 euro. In Italy, it's over twice as expensive. In Spain, somewhere in between. And so, but compare this to the emissions price, which was hovering at 5 euro a ton for most of the last year. I think it's up a couple euro now. But so it's like, almost 10 times as big as the emissions price. And then you look at solar, it's another order of magnitude higher. So the question is, why are we paying, why are we subsidizing these technologies when it's so much more costly than, having coal-fired plants become more efficient and switching to natural gas, say, when there are other ways of reducing emissions. So is it just that, we're looking at different things, the scientists and the politicians? Or, are there some reasons? So are we ignoring some other rationales for technology policy? So basically, the way I think about this is, do these additional costs that we're carrying to support renewable energy policies, do they bring some other value that we're not capturing when we're just thinking about the value of an emissions reduction? Okay. So what might these additional values be? What might be reasons for wanting technology policy on top of an emissions price? Okay, so job creation, kind of industrial policy reasons. So the question, so why isn't the emissions price activating technology change in those industries? Okay, so we've got job creation. Sorry, my handwriting's terrible. Other ideas? Yeah. Economies of scale. Now again, why wouldn't the incentives from the emissions price get you there? Also because these are new technologies. Okay? So if the carbon price is low, you have a new technology, so we're not going to incentivize a lot of deployment. But if you can build out that deployment, you might be able to bring the cost down. Scale economies is one, innovation is another. Okay, so what about, we tend to think in terms of market failures. So what kind of other market failures might be in play? So we saw scale economies. Let's see if we can think of some others. What might be some barriers to technology deployment? Yeah, okay. So we can have, and those can, raise this. Yeah, so and that can be related to capital constraints or undervaluation for some reasons, behavioral. So there can be behavioral components in this. What about market failures in innovation? How might that arise? So innovation takes a lot of work. It takes R&D. It takes learning. So we're going to talk a lot about innovation market failures. And then let's see. So policy failures. So what are some policy failures? Well, what's the biggest one? Subsidies, so like the fossil fuel subsidies we saw that are basically incentivizing the wrong kinds of fuels. The carbon price, €5 too. So underpricing of carbon. And also the fact that some sectors aren't even included in the cap and trade system. Okay, so it's not, like, even though, even in countries where there is a cap and trade system, it's not necessarily comprehensive. Okay, so there are a lot of reasons why you might not have the degree of technological innovation and deployment that you might want. And then the other thing I would raise would be political constraints and multiple objectives. So we heard job creation is certainly one. So worries about competitiveness. What are some others? Right. Yeah, so we all see what's happening in Ukraine right now. Okay, so concerns about energy dependence or independence, energy security. Actually, it's better. Yeah, that's great. Any others? Other objectives that policymakers might have that don't tend to show up in our objective function, which is just maximizing our notion of welfare. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, yeah, so they're worried about, how people are going to vote and what, their constituents or their most vocal constituents care about, which isn't always, let's fully price carbon. Okay, so I think we caught, so I made a little list here, and I think we caught a lot of it. I put in bold the ones that we're going to talk about today. So yeah, underpricing, emissions, knowledge spillovers. I'll talk a lot more about that. Emissions leakage. Actually, we'll talk more about that next week. So when you're pricing emissions but your competitors aren't. Behavioral gaps we brought up. So there may be reasons that people undervalue energy efficiency investments. Option values and uncertainty. Thomas and I have worked a little bit on that. There can be other issues like network effects that go into barriers to adoption. So we brought up scale economies, but they're also layered into that can be network effects. Like you need, in the absence of a lot of wind turbines being installed, you don't have the guys who know how to maintain them and vice versa. You have a lot of other technological barriers like in the electricity sector to make sure that these distributed sources of generation are hooked up to the grid. You can have technological lock-in, path dependence, even imperfect competition. The electricity sector is a great example where there are a lot of other challenges, regulatory challenges, because it's not, there are a lot of natural monopolies kind of involved in certain parts of the process. So it's not like a really competitive market. So there are a lot of reasons why you might think that emissions pricing alone isn't gonna do it. And then I think we touched on some of the other policy constraints and other objectives that policymakers can get. So I think we hit this. So you have distributional concerns, especially about industry costs, but also consumers in the US. This is certainly a big deal. How much is it going to cost consumers? How much will it raise their electricity prices because they vote? Regional development, jobs, exports, etc. Okay, so today we're going to talk about using some fairly simple economic models to address these questions. So I'm basically going to have a bunch of linear supply and demand curves to think about innovation. So innovation is going to change costs over time. So the minimal, kind of model we need for that is 2 stages. So we have a before and an after stage. And then in general we'll have innovation that's going to reduce costs by a certain percentage. So we want to look at, well, what's the social value of innovation? What do optimal policy combinations look like when we have multiple market failures? And then what's the cost of suboptimal policy combinations, which is much more likely what we see in practice. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little paper I did in energy economics a few years back. And the central question here is, does emissions underpricing justify more public support for innovation? Okay, so the idea here is that first of all, you have knowledge spillovers, which basically means that, so with knowledge spillovers, if you innovate something, invent something, or innovate it, then you're going to have a hard time really appropriating all of the social gains for that. Yeah, you might get a patent and you can license the technology, but to a certain extent, other folks see that, oh, that's a good idea. Maybe I'll figure out how to do that in a slightly different way. They can imitate around it. Patent protection isn't perfect. And also a lot of innovation is just, things if you're learning in your company how to do something a little better or make your wind turbine a little more efficient, some of your workers might, leave and go to another company and share some of that information. I mean, you go to conferences, you tell people. So, information gets out there, and if you have a great idea, that doesn't mean that you personally get all of the economic rewards generated by that innovation. So it's, we're going to think about the knowledge spillovers here in the context of imperfect appropriation. And so what does that do? That's going to affect your incentives to innovate, because the at least monetary reward you get from that doesn't reflect the full social value of that innovation. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. So let's start. So we're starting out, we might have some knowledge spillovers, and then on top of that, we have emissions being underpriced. So what that means is that innovation in clean technologies is then going to be further undervalued because, the emissions reductions that you get from it aren't completely valued. But on the other hand, the problem is with lower emissions pricing, you also have less incentive to adopt the clean technologies. Okay, so it's easy to see what that does to the private innovation incentives, but then that also affects the social gains from innovation, because you can innovate some more and you can subsidize innovation and get more of it, but how much more is that going to expand deployment if your carbon price is too low? So it also affects the social value of innovation. That's kind of the point of this paper. And so we can see it here. Just here we have, say, the Pigouvian. If we tax carbon at the Pigouvian level, and here we have a marginal abatement cost curve before innovation. And then innovation is going to, shift all those costs down by a certain percent, is the assumption here. And so we shift down the marginal cost curve. And so if we have Pigouvian pricing, we really ramp up our abatement. And if you have perfect patent protection, so no knowledge spillovers, so the innovator really reaps all those gains, they're the same as the social gain. And really that's the value of that whole cost reduction. It's in part lower costs that you get up to the abatement you were doing before, and then also the benefits of the additional abatement that you're getting, or fewer carbon payments, because it's now cheaper, your costs are cheaper to abate than to pay the tax. Okay? So is that clear? Yes? Right. So we're not going to go into that, but that is an issue in the innovation literature. So if you have multiple people trying to innovate at the same time, you can actually have cost redundancy in innovation. So that actually tends to sort of if anything, diminish. So and that you can often have too much investment in innovation in that kind of framework because everyone's spending the same money. But then you can insert uncertainty and other reasons why you want to have multiple efforts. So with this here, though, we're just going to look at, what is the effect of a cost reduction, and so then what are the gains from that, and what might the private versus the social gains be? Okay. So now what happens if you have suboptimal emissions pricing? So now you set your price here, and it's below the Pigouvian marginal benefit of emissions reductions. So now we see, so you have the same amount, for the same amount of innovation, you see now the private gain from innovation, again this is assuming no spillovers, is now this triangle. So you're starting out with much less abatement. You have lower costs and you'll increase abatement, but not to the same extent that you did before. On the other hand, though, because you're priced so far below the actual marginal benefit, this additional abatement has a much bigger social benefit. Okay, so now you have a rectangle instead of a triangle, essentially. So this sort of pink rectangle up there is the additional welfare gain to society because you're getting more abatement, and that has additional value beyond what the private sector is having to pay for these emissions. So here you have a social value, a total social value that exceeds the private value. So you have this social premium to innovation. Well, so it's the price relative to the, so you can make this up, and we'll see as you vary that how important that is for what this, so we'll get there in a second. So we can define the social premium to innovation as basically being the excess of the social value over the private gains, say for an incremental increase in innovation or reduction in abatement costs. So this is going to be a type of indicator is how big is the role, public role, for supporting R&D. And what's nice about this little linear model is then we just have rectangles and triangles, and it's very easy to express this. And if we throw in, I guess I should have done a picture with if we have spillovers, then basically you have the private innovator only getting some fraction of this triangle, some share of this triangle. So then the social premium would also include the rest of that triangle plus the rectangle. Okay. Okay. So for example, so now we're going to play around with these different parameters. Okay. So first let's take the case where there are no knowledge spillovers. So that's kind of what the pictures said. We don't have knowledge spillovers, but we might have underpricing. So on the y-axis we have the social premium expressed as the share of the optimal gain. So that was that first triangle that we saw. Okay. And so we see here that, starting from 0, if the carbon price is 0, then there's no social premium for innovation because you can innovate all you want, but no one's going to use it. Okay? So as we raise the carbon price, the social premium to innovation actually goes up. And it goes up, and then it peaks somewhere around 50%. So, and after this, then it goes down again. So why do you think it goes down after the carbon price is more than half of the Pigouvian price? Right, exactly. So then the private incentives for innovation are kicking in, and that triangle's getting bigger. So then you have, relative to the rectangle. So then it's going down. And then you can think of, obviously, if you have 100% emissions pricing, no other market failure, because we don't have spillovers in this case, then there's no additional rationale for technology policy. So then the social premium is 0, okay? Because you fully priced your externality and we don't have other spillovers to worry about, so there's no reason for additional. So we see here, if in the absence of spillovers, then the biggest social premium is really when emissions are priced halfway. Okay, suppose we have 100% spillovers now. Then we see that there's no private incentive for innovation. So then the question is, how much public R&D do we want to do to lower abatement costs and give it away to industry? And so here we see there's a monotonic relationship with emissions pricing. So again, if there's no emissions pricing, nobody's going to use it, so who cares? And the more and more you price emissions, the more and more people are going to use it, so then the bigger is your abatement effect, additional abatement, and so you want to subsidize innovation more. The social premium is the excess value of innovation, of a reduction in abatement costs over, excess over the private gains from a cost reduction, expressed as a share of what would the total gains be at the optimal emissions pricing, optimal policy.
In monetary terms.
So it's back to, oops. Okay. So the social premium, so this is the optimal, the gains under optimal pricing. So this triangle, this big triangle. Then the social premium is defined as whatever the social gains in excess of the private gain. So in this case, it's the rectangle. If we also had knowledge spillovers, there'd be some of this triangle. And then in these graphs, I'm expressing that as a share of that previous big triangle we saw, the gains under optimal policy. Okay, so now this is another in-between example. Suppose we have, yeah. So you're making, so can there be a situation in which the company gets more than 100% of the gains from? Well, it's something positive for society, and but the question, the innovator in this context, it means that the innovator is. Whoever's innovating gets some benefits from the innovation, but it's not as big as the benefits to society because other actors also benefit from that innovation in the sense that it spills over. Now, but there may be other feedbacks that spill back onto the firm. But I think the common description is that. And there have been studies in the overall economy that the social value of R&D is roughly double the private value to R&D because it tends to spill over to other actors in ways that you may not realize. So it may not be as directly related to patent or technology. It may influence some other sector in ways that you don't know. But it's the idea that there is more value to society than what the innovator herself gets from coming up with the idea. Okay, so just one last graph. In this example, so we have 50% spillovers, and then we see something kind of in between the two previous graphs. So as you price the social cost more, we see it rising, and then at one point, and then at some point it starts to decline again once the private sector has more incentive to innovate. Okay. So sort of putting this together on two axes. So here we have the share of marginal costs that are priced, and this is the share of spillovers in the gains from R&D. So we see across the board, if you have very little of your emissions being priced, so there's very little market incentive to deploy the technology, regardless of the level of spillovers, this other market failure, there isn't a big social premium to to bringing down the cost of the technology, because the incentives to adopt it are so low. Again, if on the other hand, the carbon price is very high, nearly fully priced, then if you have low spillovers, so little market failure, then there isn't much rationale. But as the spillovers get bigger, then you have more rationale for intervening, for getting that social premium. And so you see this sort of like upper right-hand quadrant is where you see the largest rationale for public support for innovation, where you have at least a certain amount of emissions being priced, and then more of a knowledge market failure to deal with. Yeah. So just thinking about how you might apply this. So this is an example I did. Suppose we have a 50% spillover rate, kind of like the economy-wide averages, and then think about different technologies for climate. Okay, so one technology could be renewables. Renewables, you already have some incentive to deploy them, and that's the electricity price. So you get some revenues, even if emissions aren't priced. You have some incentive to deploy competitive renewable energy technologies. And so here, suppose you don't have any climate policy like in the US, even without a carbon price, over 90% of the social value of of this product is already priced, because of the carbon price component was actually small relative to the benefits in terms of the revenues you can get from electricity or offsetting other sources that you need. Reducing coal inputs is another technology option. You get benefits from improving the efficiency of your coal plant, but a lot less than you would if carbon were priced at the social value, which I'm assuming is $25 in this case. So then only a little less than 2/3 of your social value is priced. As opposed to carbon capture and sequestration. Okay, this is an end-of-pipe abatement technology, basically. And so in the absence of a carbon price, you have no incentive to use it. It only imposes a cost and doesn't get you any value unless you're getting emissions credits for it, right? Okay, so if you're not pricing carbon, then 0% of the social value is priced. So then look at, so here's the ratio, the optimal ratio of R&D spending to optimal policies in this case. So you want 13% more for renewables, and because emissions is underpriced and you have these knowledge market failures. 33% more for coal inputs, that combination there, but you wouldn't do any spending on CCS because nobody's going to adopt it. On the other hand, if you have something in between, like a $15 a ton carbon price, you actually want to shift more of your portfolio into CCS, because now there'll be some uptake, and to make up for the lack of incentive, you've got nearly full incentive for renewables already, so you don't have a lot of additional, you have a little bit to deal with the knowledge spillovers, but you don't have that much additional relative to what you would want to spend if the carbon price were at the Pagodian level, and a bit more for coal. Okay, so that's sort of one way. But might there be other reasons to invest in reducing the cost of your technology? So one that I came up with is, well, and this is an argument that people make, if we can bring down the cost of CCS or renewable technologies and other things, then we can raise the carbon price. Then people may be more accepting of pricing carbon more fully because it won't cost them as much. So that kind of idea, and indeed, so if your emissions price will adjust upward as costs fall, then so your constraint then may be, say, we have a maximum total amount that we're willing to pay to reduce emissions, then yeah, you get more abatement if you bring the cost down and you get a higher price. It could also have to do with sort of uncertainties, ahead of implementing a cap and trade system, you don't really know what the costs are going to be. It can also be that, if the costs of a regulation are going to be lower, then there's less incentive for folks to lobby and pay and try to fight it. It's like, okay, just put it in. On the other hand, though, what does this do for innovators? If the innovators are also firms that are subject to the carbon regulation, then if they are going to innovate and they think their innovation is actually going to allow carbon prices to go higher, they're not going to want to do it. So that's a disincentive for them to innovate. Okay, so then you can actually be reducing the private incentives for innovation by doing this, but that, it may raise the public rationale. So those are some other things to think about. Okay, so I think we'll take a little break and then talk about, I'll give you a little teaser here. So some work that I've done with Richard Newell, and then a recent work with also Louis Prionis. And so this is initially thinking about this question of, so given that we may have these other constraints, how effective then are technology policies as a substitute for carbon pricing, for the carbon pricing that we can't get? And just as a little teaser, so this is from our first paper, our 2008 paper in GEAM. So when you have these multiple market failures, so emissions externality and knowledge market failures for R&D and learning by doing, then, ideally what you want is an optimal policy portfolio with both emissions pricing and then some support to correct for the spillovers. Then if you compare these things to, this wasn't a very ambitious emissions target, so we had an emissions price here, then what are the costs of using other policies instead of the emissions price? So we looked at a tradable emissions performance standard. So this we'll be talking about on Monday. So it's basically you have sort of an average emissions target rather than a cap. That's a little more costly. Or you can just tax the fossil output. But that doesn't do a good job of distinguishing between your dirtier and cleaner fossil modes of generation. Or you can just subsidize renewables. So we can see subsidizing renewables is like 2.5 times as costly as just imposing an emissions price. So it starts getting more and more costly. And then if you only rely on subsidizing innovation, then that actually gets really expensive. Of course, you can do it, you can push that wedge enough, but then you're postponing all of your action until a second stage. So you're giving up opportunities to reduce emissions today, and also opportunities to reduce emissions through other means like fuel shifting or conservation. So it ends up being more than 12 times as expensive. So that's a little teaser, and then I'll go into greater depth with that in the new paper that we have that has updated that. But let's take a little break first, and you can come up and ask me questions if you have any.